The wagon came up the river road before the mud had softened enough to bother the wheels, which told her the driver had pushed through early, before the sun had a chance to do its work. She heard it from the porch. One horse, not two. A man who was in a hurry, but not a rider. The way the pace settled and steadied on the straight stretch before the gate. The way a person drives who wants to arrive looking unhurried and has been practicing. She did not stop working when the wagon turned into the yard. She had a piece of harness across her knee, a cracked trace belonging to the Pelletier boy, the younger one, who was harder on his equipment than his father had been. And she finished the pass of thread she was on, drew it tight, bit it off close to the leather. Only then did she stand. The man who climbed down was dressed for a city and had decided, somewhere between Winnipeg and here, not to apologize for it. His coat was good wool. His boots had been clean before the yard mud reached them. He carried a briefcase by the handle the way men carry things they set down on desks, not on farmhouse steps. He looked at the house, then at her, and seemed briefly uncertain which way the introduction was meant to go. "Morning," he said. She did not answer that. Behind her, the door was still. Soren was inside, at the table, where she'd set him with a strip of scrap leather and 2 awls and told him to practice his spacing. The boy had a good eye. He'd learned to check his work by feeling the back of the leather with his thumb. "I'm here for my nephew," the man said. He said it the way men say things they have rehearsed. Not unkind, not even cold, just already past the part where the other person might have an objection. "He's family. He belongs with us now that my brother's passed." He reached into the briefcase and produced a document, folded in thirds, a solicitor's office stamp on the outside fold. She looked at it. She did not reach for it. "I have a letter," she said. He blinked. "Written in your brother's hand before he died. Not a caretaking arrangement, a guardianship." She said the last word the same way she said the price of a repair, not threateningly, just exactly. Legal, witnessed and registered with the land office in Portage la Prairie. Something shifted behind his face. Not anger. More like a man who has arrived at a door he expected to open and found it locked from a direction he hadn't considered. "That's not what I've been told," he said. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." The horse in the wagon shifted in the traces. A magpie lifted from the fence post along the south paddock and crossed the yard without landing. The briefcase hung from his hand, the document still folded between them, like a question neither of them had finished asking. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of looking that is also measuring. Then he looked at the house. She did not follow his gaze toward the window where she knew, without turning, that a boy was watching from the right-hand side of the frame, the side where the shadow covered more of the glass. "He stays," she said. The magpie called once from the fence line and did not call again. A week before the wagon came, she had been at the stove when she heard the doctor's horse in the lane. She knew the animal, a bay gelding with a hitch in its right foreleg that made it sound slightly uneven on hard ground, like a man tapping his foot to a song everyone else had forgotten. She'd been hearing it since November. Dr. Finlay stood in the yard with his hat still on. He was holding an envelope that had been carried against a body long enough to go soft at the corners. "He gave me this in October," he said. "Told me to hold it. Said if the winter went the way he expected it to go, I was to bring it out at thaw." She took it. It was heavier than letters usually were, and warmer than paper had any right to be after a ride like that. "You knew," she said, not a question. "I knew he was dying before he told you what he wanted from you," Dr. Finlay said. "That's not the same as knowing everything." She went inside. She set the envelope on the table, away from where Soren could reach it. He was in the yard just then, checking the ice on the rain barrel, which he did most mornings in the same methodical way. He did most things, thoroughly and without announcing the result. She put the kettle on. Her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. The doctor stood in the open doorway without coming in, the April cold working around his boots. When she broke the wax, her hands were steady enough. She read it once quickly, the way you read something you're afraid of, and then again slowly. It was not what she'd been told. It was back in October. Not a caretaking letter, not a seasonal arrangement, not a favor exchanged for a deed to some pasture land. It was a letter in a hand that had clearly cost something. The lines uneven, the ink pressed harder at the starts of words and thinner by the ends, the way writing looks when a man is spending strength he doesn't have much of left. He had named her not by her role or her circumstance, but by her full name, which she hadn't told him herself. He must have asked someone. Guardian, he had written, not caretaker. He had underlined it once. It was the only word he'd underlined. She read the word 3 times before she set the letter down. He didn't tell me this, she said. No, the doctor said. I don't imagine he told you much he thought you'd argue with. Outside, Soren had moved from the rain barrel to the fence line, where he was running his fingers along the top rail, the way he ran his fingers along everything, checking, cataloging, making sure the world was still the same shape it had been the last time he'd looked. She sat very still at her table with a dead man's handwriting in her hands, and understood, for the first time entirely, what she had agreed to when she'd said yes in October, and what it was going to take to keep. Before the letter, there was January, and the cold settled in for good and not going anywhere. And the boy's coat had come through the door one afternoon with a torn pocket. Not ripped clean, just the seam at the bottom gone slack, the kind of wear that happens slowly, and then all at once seems like it had always been that way. She could have mended it herself in 5 minutes. She had mended worse in less, and with worse light. Instead, she pulled the mending basket to the table and set out 2 needles. She pushed the spool of heavy thread toward him, without explaining why. Soren looked at the needle, then at her. She threaded her own needle and started on the back of the pocket, not watching him. He licked the end of the thread the way she did. She had noticed him noticing, the way he noticed everything she did, filing it away behind his eyes, and tried the eye of the needle 4 times before he caught it. His first stitches were too far apart, too shallow. The second set bunched where he'd pulled too hard. The line wandered. She didn't take the coat from him. She didn't unpick a single stitch. Closer together, she said, but don't pull, let the thread sit. By the time the pocket was closed, the seam ran in a slight curve from one corner to the other, dipping in the middle the way a fence line dips between posts on uneven ground. There was a gap near the top wide enough to see the lining through. He held the coat up and looked at it, waiting for the verdict the way he waited for most things, quiet, patient, already prepared for whatever came. She took the coat, turned it right side out, smoothed the pocket once with her palm, and hung it on the peg by the door. She did not restitch it that night, or the morning after. He wore it out the next day to feed the chickens, the crooked seam on the outside, and when he came back in, he pulled the pocket open once, with 2 fingers to check the inside, the way you check something you've mended yourself to be sure it held. It held. She noticed the checking. She said nothing about it. The following Tuesday, when nothing needed mending at all, she set the basket out again and asked, without looking up, if he'd like to try a hem. He was already reaching for the needle before she'd finished asking. Before the coat, before the pocket, there was February, and the cold snap that came through like it had a grudge. The boards on the north wall contracted in the night with a sound like a shot, and she woke and listened. Just wood, just cold doing what cold does, and went back to sleep. It was the second sound that brought her fully awake, smaller, coming from the other side of the curtain that divided the main room from where the boy slept, on the narrow cot by the window, not crying. A kind of caught breath going in and snagging, over and over. She was across the room before she decided to move. He was sitting up in the dark blanket at his waist, both hands pressed flat against his own knees. His eyes were open and fixed somewhere that wasn't the room. She sat on the edge of the cot. The rope frame took her weight with a creak. He didn't look at her. His hand stayed on his knees. She waited. Outside, the cold worked the north wall again, a low groan that moved through the boards and up through the floor and into the soles of her feet where they rest on the planking. Then he opened one hand. He had something in it, a small carving, birchwood, no bigger than her thumb, A bird. She hadn't seen him make it, but she'd seen the knife, and she'd seen the pale curls of wood on the floor near the stove, which she'd swept up without asking what they were for. He placed the carved bird in her palm. She closed her hand around it. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't ask anything. She sat with him until the caught breathing evened and the hands unclenched from his knees and the weight of him shifted from braced to resting. Then she banked the stove. It didn't need it, and went back to bed and lay awake a long time with the carved bird still in her fist. The north wall kept doing what it was doing. She listened to it and thought that some things, once you understood what they were, couldn't be quite unheard. The cold snap came and went, and January had its church social, potluck supper in the hall, someone's fiddle tuned flat all evening, the smell of wet wool and scorched coffee. She went because not going would have said more than going did. Soren stood at her side, the way he always stood in public now, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm through her sleeve. A woman named Mrs. Pelletier, not the Pelletiers whose boys' harness she mended, but the others, from up the river road, set down her cup and looked across the room. "Isn't that the Carew boy from over by St. Rose?" She kept cutting the spice cake. "He's staying with me. Since October, I heard." Since October. His uncle's been asking. From Winnipeg, I heard he wrote to the land office. She set down the knife. She put a slice of cake on a plate and handed it to the nearest child, without looking at whose it was. "I know what he's been doing," she said. The room had gone the particular quiet of people who were listening without appearing to. The fiddle player had stopped tuning, not because he'd found the note, but because something more interesting was happening. "He's a solicitor," Mrs. Pelletier said, the uncle. "A great many of them are," she said, and picked up the knife again. It was not an answer. Both women knew it. But it was the kind of not answer a room could settle around without picking further, the way you leave a splinter in rather than dig for it in company. Walking home after, the road was in fact clear, hard-packed, cold, perfectly passable. Soren walked half a step behind her, his breath coming out in short white puffs, his hands tucked into the mittens she'd finished for him in December, late after setting them aside twice after picking them up again. The road crackled under their boots. Above them, the sky had gone that particular prairie dark, heavy and close, the kind that settled before more snow. "The truth keeps," she said when they were nearly home. She wasn't sure if she was saying it to him or to herself, same as you do. He looked at her sideways once. Then he looked back at his boots on the road. She didn't say the rest of it. That she had already written to the land office herself 3 weeks before the potluck supper, and that the land office had already written back, and that their reply was sitting in the tin on the second shelf of her pantry between the salt and the dried beans, which was where she kept things she couldn't afford to misplace. 3 nights before Christmas, she'd heard Dr. Finlay's knock, 2 short, a pause, 1 long. The habit of a man who had spent decades announcing himself to houses where sickness lived and did not want to seem urgent even when he was. She lit the lamp and went to the door in her heavy shawl. He stood with snow on his shoulders and his bag in one hand, and his face had the particular settled quality of a man who has already delivered the news once in his own mind on the ride over and is now on the second telling. "He's gone," he said, "sometime this afternoon. Found him in the chair by the kitchen window. He had the stove going. He wasn't cold." She said nothing at first. The house behind her was quiet. Soren asleep in the back room. The wind that had been at the north wall all month. "Alone," she said. "He sent his hired man to his sister's for Christmas 3 weeks ago. Told him not to rush back. The boy who does his wood got the holiday too." Dr. Finlay shifted his bag to the other hand. "I think he knew what he was doing. He sent Soren away in October," she said, "so the boy wouldn't have to watch." "I expect so." Snow was coming down past the lamplight, loose and slow, the kind that meant a long fall of it rather than a storm. She stood in the doorway with the cold working past her ankles. "Does anyone else know?" "His brother will know by morning. I sent word to Winnipeg before I came here." A pause. "I didn't say anything about the boy. That's not my business." "No," she said. "It isn't." He nodded once and turned back toward his horse, waiting at the gate with its head low. She closed the door without a sound. She stood in the front room with the lamp still going and listened to the house the way she'd been listening to it for 2 months now. For breathing, for the particular quality of silence that meant a child was awake and pretending otherwise. Tonight there was only the wind and the stove ticking as the fire settled. She would not tell him tonight. Not with the snow just starting. Not with the holiday quiet still sitting undisturbed in his face. She banked the stove, though it didn't need it, and went to bed and lay awake for a long time. 3 weeks before that, the father had come to the gate on a horse that had been pushed too hard. The animal was breathing with its sides going, not distressed, just spent, the way horses look at the end of a ride someone else decided the pace for. He didn't dismount right away. He sat with one hand pressed flat against his ribs, like a man bracing against something that was coming from the inside. Then he came down slow. He did not come up onto her porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps, and she stood at the top, and there was a plank width of distance between them that he seemed to have decided, without being told, not to cross without asking first. He took a handkerchief from his coat, coughed into it, turned his face to the side. When he brought the cloth back down, there was something dark on the white that hadn't been there before, and he folded it quickly before she could look at it too long. "I have a son," he said, 8 years old. "He doesn't speak. His mother's been gone 2 years. I need someone to keep him." He said it plainly, the way a man says the thing he has been building toward for a long time. Till spring, possibly longer. He didn't explain why longer might matter more than spring. He didn't need to. She'd already seen the handkerchief. "I can pay," he said. He named a deed. "The east pasture along the creek, 40 acres, good water access. It's yours if you'll take him." She looked at him for a while without speaking. He let her, standing in the October cold with his hat in one hand, and the horse breathing behind him, and the sky the flat gray color of a season that had made up its mind. "Where's the boy now?" she said. "At the Pelletiers, the good ones. I didn't bring him until I knew." "Knew what?" "Whether you'd say yes." A magpie cut across the yard without stopping. Neither of them followed it with their eyes. "Can he eat what I eat?" she said. Something moved in his face, not surprise exactly, like a man finding a door where he had expected a wall. "He's not particular," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "he can eat what you eat." She nodded once, the way she nodded over accounts that balanced. "Bring him Saturday. I'll want the deed written, not just spoken." "You'll have it." He did not thank her. He put his hat back on and stood another moment as if there were something else to say, and then he didn't say it. He got back on the horse more slowly than he'd gotten off it, and he rode back down the river road toward town, and she stood on the porch watching him go, the frost already on the fence posts, the sky pressing down its flat gray, not giving anything away about what it planned to do next. That was October. This was April. The frost was gone from the fence posts now, long gone, and the mud in the yard had dried enough that the morning light caught it in small ridges where boots and hooves had worked through it all winter. The fields beyond the paddock had gone pale green. New grass not yet sure of its claim on the ground. The road that had carried him away, that gray October morning, had carried, weeks ago now, a wagon from the city, with a man in good wool and a briefcase and a document stamped in a solicitor's office, and had carried that wagon away again empty, the wheels cutting fresh ruts in the mud on their way back toward wherever they'd come from. She had not watched him go the way she'd watched the father go. She'd gone inside and closed the door, and that had been sufficient. Now she sat on the south step with the moccasins in her lap. She had cut the leather in November, moose hide, good and soft, traded for harness work from a man who knew the difference, and traced Soren's feet on a piece of birch bark, the way her mother had shown her, because it was more accurate than guessing and more respectful of the hide than wasting it on a mistake. She'd set the first stitch on the right one the evening after he arrived while he sat across the hearth watching her hands. One stitch, pulled tight, the thread sitting in the leather cleanly. Then she stopped. She set them aside in the basket and worked through November on harnessed leather, traces and cinches, and a saddle skirt for a farmer who paid on time and knew what he was asking for. That work had endings she could see. It had owners who would come and collect it, and uses that were clear and bounded. She did not have to wonder, when the leather left her hands, whether she'd promised anything she hadn't meant to. The moccasins were different. She picked them up again in January, the night Soren pressed the carved bird into her palm. She put in 2 more stitches. She set them down. It was not the leather that stopped her. Leather was simple. It was the thought that came behind the stitching, the way thoughts did when the hands were busy and the mind was left alone. That to close this seam was to say he will be here when they're finished. That she was making something for feet she was assuming would still be here in spring, still be here to grow into them. Nobody had given her that assurance, not in words she could take to any office or hold up under any seal. She set them in the basket. She blew out the lamp. She picked them up again in February. In March, she finished the right one and half the left before Soren came in from the barn one evening and stood in the doorway watching her work, and she looked at his feet in his worn-out boots, the heel on the right one starting to go again, same as it had in January, and understood that the stitching was going to finish itself whether she'd fully decided or not, and that what she had been waiting to know had already become known sometime between the first frost and the last one, without her having to make a formal decision about it at all. She finished the left one that evening, with him sitting across from her on the floor, watching her hands the way he watched everything she did. Not with need, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone learning a language that doesn't use words. She did not give them to him that night. She set them on the shelf by the door, toes toward the yard. In the morning, the shelf was empty. She found him on the south step, this step where she was sitting now, with the moccasins on and his feet placed flat against the ground. He was pressing the toe of the right one down into the soft earth, not hard, just firmly, the way you press on a floor you want to be sure about. She sat down beside him with her coffee already going cold. She didn't say anything. He didn't look up. He pressed his toe down again. Over the fence line, the magpies were going at each other in the cottonwoods. The east field had mostly given up its snow. Somewhere past the ridge, a horse was moving at an easy trot. Nothing urgent, just going somewhere it had decided to go. Soren pressed his toe into the earth and left it there. She drank the cold coffee. She did not reach for the other things waiting in her basket, though she knew there would be other winters. Other leather worn through, other lamps burned down to nothing, while she worked out whether she was willing to answer a question nobody had said out loud. The moccasins held. Down the road, a wagon went past without slowing, and neither of them turned to look.